In the middle of your first year, suddenly you're handed one of the biggest challenges I would think that a Prime Minister could have, certainly in the early stages of the job. The explosive issue of the High Court ruling on Mabo, in the Mabo case, which had enormous implications, both symbolically and legally. Now, what was your immediate reaction to that?
Well, I put a statement out saying I welcome the Mabo decision, and I thought it was a chance to turn a new page in the country's relationship with its Indigenous population. And I saw that, I believed that, and of course I acted with all speed to take the advantage of the High Court decision.
Your Redfern speech, just weeks from the '93 election, is now regarded as a landmark speech, a landmark moment in Australian history. Did you have a sense of history as you made that Redfern speech?
In the office I'd always say, look, we'll never do any good in this thing with them until we own up to it all, until we tell the truth of it all, you know. And so it was the year of Indigenous people. 1992 was the celebration of the Year of Indigenous People under the UN auspices. And so this was the speech on the day. And I wanted in that speech to take the opportunity of making those declaratory remarks and also in invoking the Mabo opportunity. Because what was remarkable about what suited me, let me say that about Mabo, was that there was always something wrong with the notion of statutory land rights. Here was Parliament of Australia, or the Parliament of Australia, seeking to give to Aboriginal people land which was never ours to give. In other words, there was a phoniness at the core to statutory land rights. But what the High Court had found was that a system of traditional titles had survived the Act of Sovereignty. In other words, the Act of Sovereignty in the declaration by the British government had not extinguished the titles that belonged to Aboriginal people in the country at the time, where previous High Courts had, under the so-called concept of terra nullius, the land of no one.
Well, they were essentially arguing that there was no such thing as an Aboriginal nation.
There was no Aboriginal nation, therefore they couldn't have titles. They had no customary traditions or titles. So the High Court found that not only, of course, recognised the customary tradition of Aboriginal people, but said that their titles, to the extent that they had them, had survived sovereignty. And it was then a case of either case law in subsequent cases to explore what those titles were and who had them, or it was a case of me taking it on legislatively to guarantee that we would not see mass extinguishments by the states of that title. Because what the High Court said was any grant of interest in land by a land manager extinguished the native title. So of course that was an invitation to the states to go into mass extinguishments, particularly in West Australia and Queensland, unless I was able to get a legislative response into place. And as you know, Kerry, we got that into place just before Christmas '93, just 18 months after the High Court decision. And it was, you know, a massive undertaking.
The Melbourne Herald-Sun described the Redfern speech as an emotional speech. Did you feel the emotion of that moment? It didn't sound to me like an emotional speech.
Yeah.
It was very carefully delivered.
Yeah, but it was. It had the power-packed words in it. In fact, Watson says in his book about me, he said we're flying in the RAF VIP aircraft over Esperance in Western Australia, and for some reason the Prime Minister looks down and said to the rolling plains of the red centre of Australia and says, without prompting, we'll never do any good with them unless we own up to it all, right? So this was always my view, you see, that we had done the murders. You know, we had we had broken the traditional way of life. But in the tricky storytelling of Australia, no one would come clean. So this was really the opportunity to acknowledge the massive injustice of the dispossession, and the original colonial sin.
Am I right then to think that while it might have been in the back of your mind as unfinished business for Australia, it really crystallised for you with Mabo, and like so many other things, once you actually engaged in a topic and made it yours, it then became a passion?
Exactly. Well, I think, and they're called events, Kerry. I mean, it's like Lincoln and slavery. I mean, Lincoln's career typically is not sort of built around the issue of slavery, but he ends up wearing it in the context of the Civil War in America, and it becomes his matter. The High Court decision, I could have been a complete lush and said, okay, Mr. High Court, you want to make these brave decisions, you live with them. You do all the case law that follows. You decide who's got the title, what the title is, who hasn't got the title, and you stop the states extinguishing it while you sit and think about it. I didn't do that. I didn't leave the High Court hanging on a limb, hanging outside. I embraced the High Court and built the great body of corporate and cultural law, so that we actually we could say what the title was, who had it, who could get it, how you would get it, and how it would be protected. So that was the urgency through 1993. In 1993, I mean, the Native Title, I worked on the Native Title Act personally in the Cabinet room for 7 to 8 months of 1993, because it required the authority of a Prime Minister to make all the key decisions as you went down them, the right to negotiate, rights to exploration, just thousands of issues that had to be done there. So I like to think that if we look at a case study of a High Court doing a thing of integrity and a federal government meeting that integrity in its own measures of integrity, the result is something the nation would be proud of in the end, and that is to own up to the dispossession and to work out how to give them their land back.
Now, when you made that Redfern speech, you're the politician, you must have made your own assessments of the political risks, particularly so close to an election. This is an issue that can be quite inflammatory. How did you assess that? What political risks did you identify?
I always believed in burning up the government's political capital, not being Mr. Safe Guy, and not having the uplift that any political personality has and needs to do what is right and good. What is right and good gives you the surge. And without the surge, what are you? You're just sort of mucking around with tricky press statements and tricky appearances and doorstops, So I was prepared to risk it. You've heard me with the roadrunner analogy, I always used to paint John Hewson as Wile C. Coyote and I was the roadrunner. And I said to the caucus one day, you know why I love that roadrunner? They all went silent. I said, he runs that fast, he burns the road up behind him. There's no road left for the others. And I've always believed in that philosophy. You burn up the road so there's just burning bitumen behind you, So the Liberal Party would never have done Mabo. Hewson called it a day of shame when the bill went through the Parliament, That dreadful Tim Fisher wrung his hands about it and said, we will have mass extinguishments everywhere. That's what I was up against. But now the country's moved forward.
Some of your more pragmatic colleagues in Labor must have been urging you to bury Mabo, at least until after that election.
Oh, that was the majority, really. And right to the end, you realise I had a sort of cabinet deputation come to say to me in November 1993 that I won't get it through and I should give it up. And I told them there's no way I'm going to give this up. Gareth had fought this long and distinguished fight in the Senate against the Greens, the two Greens from Western Australia, and the opposition, and there were desperate moments in the passage of it. But you see, in the end, if you want to crunch the changes through, you've got to hold your nerve and squeeze the system to the end, you know.
Did you persuade the Greens?
Well, I certainly threatened them, and badly, bruisingly threatened them.
What did you say?
Oh, I said I'd come to Western Australia and campaign against them for their scant regard for Aboriginal justice, and for their view that they knew better. I said, you know, this is a classic Whitey's view. We know better. Here's the Aboriginal senior Aboriginal people holding out the agreement with the government to see the bill into place, but you know better. You know better.
You'd never really negotiated with Aboriginal people over something substantial before.
Well, no one had.
And you weren't just dealing with one clearly definable leadership of the Aboriginal nation. There was no such thing.
No, that's true.
How did you approach that negotiation, and how sharp was your learning curve?
There is no parliament of Aboriginal people in Australia. And so when they came to see me with the 10-point plan about Mabo, broadly the land councils, I said, look, I will negotiate with you, but you don't know how to negotiate. What you have are these bald claims. And if we don't accept all the claims, we're sort of racist, you know? Whereas when you negotiate, you hang on to the things which are centrally important to you and you give up some things that are not centrally important to you, right? In other words, there is a negotiation. But have you the courage to negotiate? I put that to the Dodson brothers, to Lowitch O'Donoghue and Noel Pearson and the others who were there. Have you the sense or the courage to negotiate? Or you just want to do the recitation of the demands and there's that sort of, you know, racist government and that hopeless Prime Minister that won't do it? Or will you measure up to it?
So you were challenging them to learn and to be flexible and to change.
Yeah.
What were they teaching you? What did you learn from that experience?
What did I learn? Firstly, that they had a very clear idea about what they wanted and what the native title decision, what the Mabo decision meant to them, culturally, legally, and that I felt in the intellectualism of it, I could negotiate a satisfactory bill which covered their central concerns and all the other concerns of everyone that owned a piece of land in Australia, including the mining companies, and everyone owned their own backyard even, you know. So, and people like Lowitch O'Donoghue displayed leadership of a kind that we'd never seen displayed before. They had the Eva Valley meeting, as you may remember. They dragged them all together, and finally they decided to negotiate. And from there on, it was then of course they ratted on me halfway through and they belted me again, and you know. But in the end they could see that I knew how to run the parliamentary system, but more than that I wanted to see justice done.
Noel Pearson emerged from that whole Mabo process as a very dynamic, young, articulate Aboriginal leader.
Yeah.
And his profile grew from that. I've read that you actually had him to the lodge one day for a lunch and quite an extensive conversation about whether he should go into politics or not. He was asking your advice, is that right?
Yeah, that had happened, yeah. Well, he's an amazing wordsmith and a truly intellectual fellow. And he had leadership qualities that I had rarely seen. But he had to make commitments. And perhaps, you know, one of the flaws in Noel's political character is he never quite makes that commitment which the party system kind of demands. There's a tremendous mind, in a legal sense, a very original legal mind, and a great storyteller and a great spinner of words. I mean, these are very rare skills.
I think he subsequently said that the message he took from that discussion was that you were sort of dissuading him from politics, that you spent a lot of time waiting around, that he might have been better thinking of a career in law.
Yeah, well, he went. He took up. He took part of a practice up in Melbourne, and then Bill Kelty and I, amongst others, had virtually found him, and he could have had the selection for the federal Labor seat of Lawler after Barry Jones, but in the end he didn't want to take it. He didn't want to take it. Then subsequently, 3 years later, he looked in New South Wales for a seat in the Labor Party in the federal parliament. But then he came to a very, I think, determinist view that without the conservative Australia being part of the compact, that the Aboriginal people wouldn't get anything sustainable. I think he was wrong about that, but that's sort of governed his life ever since. But
were you ultimately disappointed that he didn't go into politics?
I think the country has missed a great leader. That's what I think Noel was and is. But it had two other great leaders at the time. Lowitja O'Donoghue and David Ross. And in the great weight of the Mabo judgments, all the ons and offs in that, high pressure year of all those technical and cultural issues, the person with the greatest weight was David Ross, who was then chairman of the Central Land Council, Yeah. So there was Ross, who provided the sort of great grey matter leadership. The courage and organisation was coming from Lowitja, and then the legal roundup at the rear was coming from Noel, amongst others. They were a formidable group. But once they knew I was truly on their side, then it was then a matter of trying to, and part of it were big technical problems about doing this without suspending the Racial Discrimination Act. It was a very hard thing to do, very hard thing to re-establish the titles. See, every land title issued after the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975 was invalid. So all these mining titles are all invalid. How do we validate them without going around the title? Anyway, we worked our way through it.